You're listening to Buried by Time, a podcast about stories, people, places, and events that still have something to tell us. Some are well known, others have nearly disappeared. Let's take a closer look. Night Gallery and the Strange Afterlife of Rod Serling. When people remember Rod Serling, they usually think of the Twilight Zone. They remember the dark suit, the cigarette, the deliberate voice. The settings often began in ordinary places, a small town, a diner, an office, or a suburban house. Then something unusual or impossible would happen. But the Twilight Zone was not the end of Serling's work in television. A few years later, he returned with another anthology series. This one was darker, stranger, and less orderly. It didn't become part of American culture in the same way, but it left behind a legacy of its own. That series was Night Gallery. Night Gallery began as a television movie that aired on NBC on November 8, 1969. The regular series followed in 1970 and ran until 1973. Like The Twilight Zone, it was an anthology in that each episode told a separate story with new characters, new settings, and a different concept. But the story introductions were different. The Twilight Zone asked viewers to imagine a strange dimension just outside ordinary life. Night Gallery placed them inside an eerie art gallery where each painting served as the doorway into a different story. Serling would stand beside the artwork like a curator, explain just enough to draw the viewer in, and then the episode would move from the painting into the nightmare it represented. A painting is usually harmless. It hangs on a wall. You can study it, admire it, ignore it, or walk past it. In Night Gallery, the painting felt less like decoration and more like evidence. It was a single image from a story that seemed to be continuing somewhere else. Maybe the story belonged to the past, a dream, or even another reality entirely. A face, a landscape, a scene, or a warning would hang on the wall as if the story was frozen in a moment in time, right before something terrible happened. The image only paused long enough for Serling to point it out. That was the basic power of Night Gallery. The viewer was not just watching a story from a safe distance. The viewer was being shown an artifact of something that happened. Note to the listener, you can visit nightgallery.net/the-paintings and see those exact paintings. They are dark colors with spikes that are blood-like red, creepy stark images, rabid animals, frozen screams, apparitions, psychosis, haunted places, nefarious faces, skulls, and renderings that look like they were scribbled out by a serial killer on death row. The difference between the Twilight Zone and Night Gallery was not only the frame, it was also the kind of fear each show seemed to understand best. The Twilight Zone often worked like a moral and psychological test. A person entered an ordinary situation, then discovered that reality had changed around them. The fear might come from paranoia, loneliness, conformity, technology, war, prejudice, or a wish that came true in the worst possible way. The show could be frightening, but its fear was often built around an idea. It asked what a person would do when the rules of the world suddenly changed. Night Gallery leaned more directly into horror and the macabre. It was more physical, more visual, and more openly grotesque. Its fears were not always ideas waiting to be understood. Sometimes they were things waiting to be seen. A changing portrait, a corpse that would not stay buried, a cursed object, a surgical reversal, an insect, a shadow on a wall, or a body punished by obsession and guilt. Where the Twilight Zone often led the viewer towards a revelation, Night Gallery often led the viewer toward a terrifying image. It did not have the same clean black and white moral sharpness. It had the uneasy color of a nightmare with old houses, strange rooms, lurid paintings, decaying secrets, and private sins that had finally taken visible formation. The gallery itself felt colder than the Twilight Zone. Serling's earlier series often began in places viewers recognized. Night Gallery felt different. It felt like a visit to a private collection owned by someone with, how should I say, very specific and disturbing tastes. That was part of the unease. The viewer was not walking into a normal room where something unusual might happen. They were walking into a place where something strange happened, and that situation had already been selected, framed, and hung on the wall. Rod Serling was still the host, and his presence gave the series authority. He did not scream, wink at the audience, or oversell the horror. He spoke in the same controlled, formal style as if he were introducing something rather ordinary. That calmness made the stories more unsettling. The stranger the image became, the more calmly Serling presented it. As though fear did not need to be exaggerated, it was already there, waiting inside the frame. The pilot movie included 3 stories: the cemetery, Eyes, and the escape route. Each one suggested a different direction Night Gallery might take. The cemetery is a story about greed, inheritance, and guilt. A young man murders his uncle, then becomes disturbed by a painting that appears to change. The image seems to show the dead uncle rising from his grave and moving closer to the house. Whether the painting is supernatural, psychological, or both is part of the effect. The frightening idea is not simply that the dead might return, it is that guilt might become visible, hang itself on the wall, and refuse to be ignored. The segment also gave the pilot one of its first memorable performances. Roddy McDowall played the greedy young man, while Ossie Davis appeared as the butler who understands more than he says. Right away, Night Gallery showed it could use familiar actors in eerie stories that played like old morality tales, but with the dust, rot, and dread of a haunted house. Eyes is one of the most historically interesting segments in the pilot because it was directed by a young Steven Spielberg and starred Joan Crawford. The story follows a wealthy blind woman who arranges to receive another person's eyes through surgery. She wants only a brief period of sight, and the episode builds toward a cruel reversal. The horror comes as much from selfishness as from the medical premise. A person with money and power believes she can buy a miracle from someone with very little. Night Gallery often returned to that kind of moral imbalance where wealth, vanity, or control allows one person to cross a line that should never have been crossed. Looking back, Eyes feels almost unreal as a piece of television history. Joan Crawford, one of the great surviving names of classic Hollywood, was being directed by Steven Spielberg near the beginning of his career. The old studio system and the future of American filmmaking met inside a Rod Serling horror anthology about borrowed sight, privilege, fear, and punishment. The escape route is about a Nazi war criminal living in hiding. He becomes obsessed with a painting in a museum and imagines escaping into it. Like many Serling stories, it connects fantasy with justice. The past is not finished with him. History is not safely behind him. He wants escape, but what he finds is judgment. Those 3 pilot stories showed that Night Gallery was simply not the Twilight Zone with darker lighting. It was closer to a haunted museum of human behavior. The stories were about greed, guilt, power, escape, and punishment. They asked what people hide, what they think they can get away with, and what might come back to claim them. The regular series continued that mood, but not always evenly. Some episodes were thoughtful and disturbing. Others were shorter, stranger, or lighter in tone. The show also included brief humorous segments and odd little side stories that could break the darker atmosphere. That inconsistency is one reason Night Gallery developed a more complicated reputation than the Twilight Zone. Serling did not have the same control over Night Gallery that he once had over the Twilight Zone. The show carried his name, his face, and many of his scripts, but it was not purely his artistic world in the same way. Producer Jack Laird had strong influence over the series, and Serling was not always happy with the direction. Some episodes lean too much on jokes, tricks, or novelty, which undercut the darker, more haunting tone Serling did best. You can feel that conflict in the show itself. Night Gallery can be brilliant, awkward, elegant, grotesque, literary, silly, and chilling, sometimes in the same hour. It is very much a product of early 1970s television, but when it works, it still has force. One of the strongest episodes is their tearing down Tim Riley's bar. It is not a horror story in the usual sense. It follows Randy Lane, a man who is getting older, growing more isolated, and losing the places that once gave his life shape. He begins seeing people from his past, including people who are gone. The story is about grief, regret, failure, and the pain of watching memory outlast the world that created it. That episode feels close to Serling's emotional center. Like Walking Distance from the Twilight Zone, it deals with nostalgia, but it does not pretend the past can save us. Memory can be comforting, but it can also become a room you cannot leave. The dead do not have to attack. Sometimes they only have to appear and remind you of what you've lost. Another memorable entry is The Caterpillar, a story of jealousy, obsession, and body horror. A man wants another man dead and arranges for a deadly insect to be placed near him. The plot turns in a physically revolting direction, but the deeper horror is his own desire. He thinks he is controlling events. Instead, he becomes trapped inside the cruelty he set in motion. That kind of story shows the sharper horror side of Night Gallery. The Twilight Zone could frighten through awareness. Night Gallery was more willing to make the viewer uncomfortable through a dead body, an object, the room, the painting, the grave, or the thing that should not be there. The show was often strongest when punishment felt intimate, not cosmic or grand, but personal. Someone makes a private choice, crosses a private line, and the world quietly rearranges itself around that decision. The idea is old and simple. Something knows what you did, and it has been waiting for you. The paintings made that idea visible. A painting does not move, at least when you are watching it. But the longer you look, the more it can seem to look back. A portrait can feel like a witness. A landscape can feel like a destination. A painted door can feel as if it might open up after midnight. That is why the gallery concept worked. It made each story feel preserved. Those were not just events, they were exhibits. The show also became a strange meeting place for familiar faces. If the Twilight Zone had created a tradition of actors stepping into unusual, self-contained stories, Night Gallery carried that tradition into a darker, more colorful decade. Burgess Meredith appeared in The Little Black Bag and later Finnegan's Flight, giving the series a direct link back to the Twilight Zone. Meredith had been one of that earlier show's most memorable performers, so his presence in Night Gallery felt like one strange television world opening a side door into another. The guest list also reached across different eras of Hollywood. Diane Keaton appeared in Room with a View before her major film stardom had fully arrived. Agnes Moorehead appeared in Certain Shadows on the Wall, a title that almost sounds like a perfect summary of Night Gallery itself. Vincent Price appeared in Class of '99 and The Return of the Sorcerer, bringing the series his unmistakable aura of gothic horror, theatrical menace, and old-fashioned macabre storytelling. Other appearances gave the show an even stranger texture. Orson Welles narrated Silent Snow, Secret Snow, making his voice part of the episode's disturbed inner world. Edward G. Robinson starred in The Messiah on Mott Street, one of the more emotionally serious Serling stories. Zsa Zsa Gabor appeared in The Painted Mirror, a title that fits the series' fascination with images, vanity, reflection, and hidden truth. Looking back, the cast list feels like another gallery inside the gallery. Classic Hollywood stars, future stars, horror icons, character actors, comedians, and science fiction favorites all passed through the same strange rooms. Some brought prestige, some brought theatrical drama, some brought the familiar face of television itself. Together, They made Night Gallery feel less like a side project and more like a crossroads. That celebrity presence tells us something important about the show. Night Gallery may be remembered as uneven, but it was not marginal. It was a network anthology hosted by Rod Serling with enough visibility and curiosity around it to attract performers from across American entertainment. It belonged inside the main current of television at a moment when that current was changing. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cleaner confidence of early television had started to crack. The country had lived through assassinations, Vietnam, political distrust, cultural upheaval, and a growing fascination with horror, the occult, and the darker side of ordinary life. Television was changing because the audience had changed. The Twilight Zone had used fantasy and science fiction to talk about Cold War fear, conformity, prejudice, technology, war, and moral failure. Night Gallery arrived in a different emotional climate. Its stories felt less like warnings from the future and more like messages from a darkened house. The fear was not always that society might collapse. Sometimes the fear was that something had already gone wrong inside one person, a selfish act, a buried crime, a private obsession, or a bargain when no one was watching. Night Gallery often began after the wrong choice had already been made. The question was not whether someone would cross the line. The question was what would come for them afterward. The show's visual style added to that feeling. Night Gallery was in color, unlike most of the original Twilight Zone. That might seem less haunting at first, but the color gave the series a different texture. The paintings, shadows, old houses, costumes, and grotesque details could feel lurid, more real, and almost dreamlike. Not every episode worked. Some segments felt underdeveloped. Some endings felt more like tricks or plot twists than revelations. The show also used brief comic pieces in between or alongside the darker stories, and those moments could feel out of place. The third season, shortened to half an hour, changed the rhythm even more. Anthology television depends on tone, and Night Gallery sometimes struggled to hold one for very long. Still, the inconsistency is part of the record. Night Gallery shows Rod Serling at a different stage of his life and career. He was no longer the young live television writer fighting to smuggle social criticism past sponsors. He was an established figure, but also a writer working inside a system that still handcuffed him. He had helped prove that fantasy could be serious. Now he was attached to a series that could be serious and literary in one segment, then feel like an easy gimmick in the next. That makes Night Gallery more than a horror anthology. It is also a record of a writer's later struggle with television itself. Serling's introductions remain one of the show's strongest features. He stands beside the paintings like a curator of moral evidence. The stories vary in quality, but his presence gives them weight. He seems to be saying, here is another human mistake, another private nightmare, another small door into consequences. The gallery is fictional, but the idea behind it feels real. Every life leaves images behind, rooms we remember, faces we avoid, places we cannot return to, objects that keep their meaning long after everyone else has forgotten why they mattered. Night Gallery is strongest when it treats horror as something personal, a decision made in secret, a guilt that will not stay hidden, a memory that keeps finding its way back into the room. The show reminds us that horror does not always begin with a terrifying monster. Sometimes it begins with a person wanting money, beauty, power, revenge, youth, escape, or control, and reaching for it in the wrong way. They reach for whatever it is and cross a line. Then the consequence happens, usually in a way they didn't expect. In Night Gallery, the punishment usually took a visible form. A painting changed, a dead person returned, a body betrayed its owner. A guilty mind began to break under the truth it had tried to hide. The horror was not random. It came from the thing the character had done, wanted, buried, or refused to face. Night Gallery never replaced the Twilight Zone in American memory. It was too uneven, too strange, and too tied to the production compromises of its time. But it has a shadowy place of its own. It is less polished and less perfect, but also more feverish, more haunted, and sometimes more disturbing. Rod Serling died in 1975, only a few years after Night Gallery left the air. That gives the show an added weight, as it was one of his final major television works, and it shows Serling in a difficult position. His best ideas were still sharp, moral, and haunting, but Night Gallery was not fully his own creation. The series carried his name and presence, while often moving in directions he probably wouldn't have taken himself. The best parts of Night Gallery understood something basic about fear. We are not only afraid of noises at night, things lurking in the woods, curses, or someone dying. We are afraid of being found out. We are afraid that the hidden thing will become visible. We are afraid that the past has kept better record than we have. In that sense, Night Gallery was well named. It was not only a show about odd paintings, it was a show about what remains after the lights go down, when a portrait or landscape, a graveyard, a room, or a road can feel less like a painting and more like a warning. And standing nearby, as calm as ever, was Rod Serling, asking us to step closer to the painting and take one more look. Because in Night Gallery, the longer you looked at the painting, the harder it became to believe it was only about someone else. The picture seemed to carry a darker message, that a person can look respectable, decent, even innocent, while something else lurks beneath, something no one else can see. The painting did not only tell a story, it revealed what we might be hiding from the world. Thanks for listening to Buried by Time. Remember, time doesn't kill history, it buries it. And if you're drawn to the story still waiting underneath, subscribe to Buried by Time and like the episode wherever that option appears. You can also support the show at buymeacoffee.com/whythankyou. And if there's a forgotten story you think belongs here, leave it in the comments. Until next time, keep looking closely. The past has a way of leaving things behind.